Now let's talk about the application of redox chemistry. This will be in terms of electrochemical cells. In general, there are two types of electrochemical cells. There is what's called electric or voltaic cells. Now these are spontaneous arrangements of redox species to give a electrical reaction. Or a non-spontaneous reaction is what's called an electrolytic cell. Now this type of cell is endothermic because energy input is required. Both of these are, however, redox reactions because they do involve the transfer of electrons. However, the transfer of electrons is not direct. They are routed through a wire, through an external wire, and then they can be also made as two half cells. The first type of cell we're going to look at is what's called a battery or electrovoltaic cell. Commonly known as a battery, it is technically better known as a electrovoltaic cell. Now, in a battery or in a cell, the reduction half reactions are separated from the oxidation half reactions. Therefore, the electrons have to transfer through a wire where work can be done. Now, these types of cells are often found in toys and calculators. Now, the flow of electrons is always from the anode, where the reduction agent is being oxidized, towards the cathode, where the oxidation agent is getting reduced. As the electrons flow through an external circuit, work can be done. And lastly, remember these voltaic cells are spontaneous, and they will happen automatically if the two electrodes are connected. Being spontaneous reactions, they're also exothermic because they produce energy to drive the work in a calculator or a toy. Let's look at the voltaic cell closely. You are required to have two half cells, a reduction half cell and an oxidation half cell. They have to be separated by a porous boundary, and when connected together with a wire, they will produce electricity. The first component of a voltaic cell is an electrode. It's a solid electroconductor where the reactions occur. You always need two electrodes in a voltaic cell. A cathode where the reduction happens, and the anode where an oxidation happens. The first of these electrodes we'll look at is the anode. This is where the oxidation is happening. A good way to remember this is a mnemonic called anox. Anode is where the oxidation happens. This is also where the anions, the negative ions, migrate during an electrolytic reaction. And remember, anions are the negatively charged ions. Some common anions are chloride and nitrate. Usually, the anode loses mass because the solid metal, for example, copper solid, is being oxidized to copper ions. Therefore, the mass of the solid electrode will eventually decrease to zero. The other electrode is the cathode. Now, this is where the reduction happens. Another mnemonic to remember this is red cat. Reduction at the cathode. This is also the electrode where the cations or the positive ions eventually migrate. And at this electrode, the electrode usually gains mass. So for example, copper ions will be reduced into copper solid at the cathode. Over time, there will be additional copper solid formed, so the mass of the cathode will increase. In a voltaic cell, you also need an external circuit. This is simply a wire or some sort of conductor for the electrons to move from the reduction agent to the oxidation agent. The electrons will always move from the anode, where the reduction agent is being oxidized, to the cathode, where the oxidation agent is being reduced. Another requirement in the voltaic cell is the electrolyte. It just merely forms an electroconduction for the ions to move. The ions will move, however, through the saltbridge. The saltbridge contains the electrolyte. It allows for the diffusion of ions, but not the bulk movement of the solution. Now this saltbridge can be also replaced by using what's called a porous cup or some sort of permeable membrane such as a wet filter paper. Another memory trick besides anox and red cat is Leo the lion is a jerk. Here, LEO means the loss of electron, means the oxidation at the anode, and GERC means the gain of electron happens at the reduction, or is a reduction reaction happening at the cathode. Let's look at some elements in a voltaic cell using the common zinc-copper battery. Now in this case, because zinc is a stronger oxidizing agent than copper, zinc will be oxidized at the anode, whereas copper will be reduced at the cathode. In the anode, you also see a solution of zinc ion in addition to the zinc solid anode. Similarly, in the cathode, not only will we see solid copper being an electrode, there will be copper ions in the solution. In this battery, the wires connected through a voltmeter, which is often a key giveaway of the arrangement being a voltaic cell rather than an electrolytic cell. The electrons will flow from the anode to the cathode. And then you also see a saltbridge connecting the two half cells. The cations are migrating towards the cathode, the copper electrode, whereas the anion, chloride, is migrating towards the anode, the zinc electrode. Over time, solid zinc is being oxidized into zinc ions, therefore the mass of the anode will slowly decrease over time, whereas in the cathode, copper ions is slowly being reduced into copper solid, therefore the mass of the cathode will slowly increase. Overall, the net equation is zinc solid plus copper ion yields zinc ions and copper solid. Let's look closely at the cathode where the reductions are happening. Again, this is where the copper ions is being reduced into copper solid. The copper ions are gaining electrons, the definition of reduction, and these electrons are coming through the wire, which are coming through from the anode. As the copper ions gain electrons, it becomes copper solid. So then, there is a lack of cations because the copper ions are being reduced. So there, in that area, there's excess anions. There's excess negative charge. To overcome that, the excess positive ions, in this case potassium ions, in the saltbridge, are being drawn towards the positive cathode in order to balance out the charges. Let's now look at the anode where the oxidation reactions are happening. In this case, zinc is being oxidized to zinc ion, and this is happening at the anode as mentioned. These electrons that are being produced are traveling through the wire to the cathode where the copper is being reduced. Now, because we are creating a lot of positive zinc ions here, right, the area around the anode will be very positively charged. To counteract that, all the chloride ions, the negative ions in the saltbridge, will be drawn towards the anode, the zinc electrode. So again, the cations are being drawn towards the cathode, the copper side, and the anions are being drawn to the anode, the zinc half side. And all this is happening through either the saltbridge or a porous cup or a wet filter paper membrane. Instead of a saltbridge, we can also use a porous cup to allow for the movement of ions. A porous cup is exactly as it sounds. It's a cup with little holes in it that allows for ions to move slowly, but not the mass bulk mixing of solutions. In some cases, we may wish to use a gas as a reactant or produce a gas as a product. In this example, we are reducing hydrogen ions in the form of HCl into hydrogen gas. The source of electrons are coming from the zinc anode, and as our cathode, we're using a platinum electrode, which is considered an inert electrode. Just exactly what is an inert electrode? It is an unreactive solid conductor where a gas can be bubbled in and electrons can react as either an oxidation agent or a reduction agent. The most common inert electrodes are carbon rods and platinum metal because they do not react with the solution but allow for the electrons to either be oxidized at the surface or reduced at the surface. So inert electrodes can be used as either a cathode or an anode. Another use of an inert electrode is when dichromate is being reduced. For example, here we have a cell where copper is being oxidized so that dichromate, Cr2 O7 2-, is reduced into chromate 3 ions. Now, because there is no solid in either of these species here, we need an inert electrode in the form of a carbon electrode here. Here, the carbon electrode serves as the cathode, where dichromate is reduced into chromium 3+. The evidence of this reaction happening is determined by the color change. In our cathode, copper is slowly being oxidized into copper ions, so the intensity of the blue solution will increase over time. On the other hand, at the cathode, the orange dichromate ions will slowly be reduced into the colorless or the greenish yellow chromate 3 ions. Therefore, the orange color of our solution will slowly decrease over time. One common way to denote a electrovoltaic cell is what's called a standard cell notation. Here on this line is our standard cell notation. You'll see that there is an anode on the left of this double line here, and the cathode is on the right of the double line here. There are single lines separating the cathode from the electrode, or the solid from the liquids. Let's look at a specific cell notation using our copper-zinc voltaic cell. Again, on the left of our double line is our anode. Here in this case is our zinc solid and our zinc ion. And on the right hand side of the double line is our cathode. In this case, our copper with our copper ion. Our double line represents our porous barrier. It could be either a saltbridge, a porous cup, or a wet filter paper. Let's look at understanding a cell notation and drawing a cell diagram. In this case, we're going to look at a copper and a silver reaction. Again, everything written on the left of the double line will be our anode. So we know that our copper solid will be oxidized into copper ion. And everything on the right of the double line is our cathode, so that we know we will have our silver ions being reduced into silver solid. The first thing we can do is we're going to draw two half cells, one on the left, one on the right. These two half cells contain a solid electrode, as well as a salt bridge connecting them, and a set of wires connecting them. Then we can predict our net redox reaction. First of all, we list all of our species. So here we have copper, copper ion, silver solid, as well as the inert electrodes, nitrate, and our water, because it's an aqueous solution. We identified that copper solid is going to be our strongest reducing agent, and silver ions will be the strongest oxidizing agent. So then we can write that the copper solid will be oxidized into copper ions, and silver ions will be reduced into silver solid. Once we figured out what is our strongest reducing agent and our strongest oxidizing agent, we can look at our table of half reactions to find our two half reactions. Now, because the reduction of silver only requires 1 electron, whereas the oxidation of copper requires 2 electrons, we need to double the half reaction for the silver reduction half reactions, so that 2 electrons are transferred in this process. Therefore, our balanced redox reaction is 1 copper solid plus 2 silver ions yield 1 copper ion and 2 silver solid. Next, we go back to our diagram and we can label our reduction at our cathode and oxidation at our anode, and that will be on the next slide. On one side of the diagram, we have our cathode, our reduction reaction, the reduction of silver ions into silver solid. And on the other side of our diagram, we have the oxidation of copper solid into copper ions. Next, we label the solid electrodes. So we have our copper solid as our anode and our silver solid as our cathode. Next, we identify the flow of the electron. Remember, electrons are always going from the anode to the cathode, the site of oxidation to the site of reduction. So in this case, it's flowing from the copper, which is on the right, towards the silver, which is on the left. Next, we show the direction of the ion migration. In this case, our inert ions is sodium nitrate, the sodium cations will migrate towards the cathode, towards the right, whereas the nitrate negative anions will migrate towards the anode, which in this case is on the left. Now to put everything together, in our final diagram, we have the diagram of a silver and copper electrode. The copper is on the anode, the silver is the cathode. The flow of electron is always from the anode to the cathode, whereas the ions, the nitrate anions, are moving towards the anode, and the sodium cations are moving through the cathode. Everything here is connected with a wire, and it should show a positive voltage value if connected properly.